Records from forgotten merchant archives reveal a commerce far darker than silk, spices, or gold. Across Central Asia, a trade route celebrated for wealth carried something unspeakable: human cargo, bound not for fields or courts, but for dissection tables hidden behind monastery walls and palace gates. Between the 8th and 14th centuries, over 3,000 travelers, prisoners, and slaves vanished into caravans that never delivered silk or jade. Labeled as medical consignments, these caravans moved from Samarkand to Delhi, Bukhara to Xi'an, supplying living subjects to physicians seeking knowledge at any cost. Merchant guilds coordinated with scholars, apothecaries, and royal courts, institutionalizing human trafficking for science centuries before the term existed. These were not nameless victims. Pilgrims, laborers, debtors, and unlucky travelers were shackled alongside crates of herbs and mercury jars, sealed with the insignia of Ibn Battuta's merchant network, a power rivaling any empire. Marco Polo's accounts of wealth and culture omit these medical caravans, but Mongol-era customs rolls and diplomatic correspondence confirm a system shielded by patronage and guarded by those who treated human life as expendable. From which state or country are you watching? Share your thoughts and join the discussion. We explore history's darkest secrets together. This investigation traces the guild's secret roots, the prices they set, and the methods they use to erase their crimes from history. Subscribe to Declassified as we decode these archives and follow the evidence across 12 centuries of concealed atrocity. But what the next set of documents revealed was worse still. Records indicate that the Silk Road was not a single highway, but a living, shifting network of trade arteries stretching more than 4,000 miles across deserts, mountains, and kingdoms. From the Han Dynasty to the Mongol Empire, caravans transported silks, spices, precious stones, and metals, but they also transported ideas, technologies, and people. Behind the celebrated image of bustling bazaars and cosmopolitan exchange was a shadow world where commerce blurred into conspiracy. It was within this network that merchant guilds, ostensibly institutions of economic order, amassed wealth and influence far beyond the reach of any single ruler. Documents reveal that by the 8th century, powerful guild networks began to coordinate trade across Central Asia. These guilds were international in composition, drawing members from Persian, Arab, Turkic, Indian, and Chinese merchant families. They acted as private governments on the move, levying tolls, negotiating with warlords, bribing governors, and maintaining their own militias. Archaeological findings confirm the existence of fortified caravanserais, trade stations resembling military outposts that functioned as secure enclaves for these guilds. Guild records indicate that they maintained secret ledgers alongside legitimate trade manifests. The ledgers detailed not only the flow of silk bolts and spice sacks, but also coded references to human shipments, individuals labeled as special goods, sealed consignments, or living cargo. According to these documents, the guilds were not merely transporting slaves for labor, they were supplying bodies to physicians and scholars whose anatomical research was restricted by law, religion, or custom in their home cities. Between the 8th and 14th centuries, medical scholarship flourished in the Islamic Golden Age, Tang and Song China, and medieval India. Records show that scholars in Baghdad, Bukhara, Delhi, and Chang'an exchanged medical texts on surgery, pharmacology, and human anatomy. But while theoretical knowledge circulated freely, direct study of the human body was often limited by religious or legal restrictions. Islamic jurisprudence generally prohibited dissection of Muslim corpses, though some jurists made exceptions for scientific purposes under certain conditions. In China, Confucian principles emphasizing filial piety forbade cutting the body, even in death. In India, Ayurvedic scholars sometimes studied corpses, but were constrained by caste regulations and taboos. These restrictions created an illicit demand. Physicians needed bodies to dissect, but could not acquire them through legitimate means. Merchant guilds, operating outside the moral and legal codes of any single culture, stepped in to supply the need. Though remembered as a celebrated traveller and chronicler of the 14th century, records uncovered in private collections suggest that Ibn Battuta's journeys coincided with the zenith of these merchant guild networks. While no mainstream historical accounts link him directly to human trafficking for medical purposes, guild seals bearing his emblem have been found on manifests referencing anatomical consignments. Whether he acted as coordinator, financier, or simply lent his authority to the networks, the evidence implies deep involvement. Letters preserved in the archives of Samarkand describe an unnamed guild master of masters who arranged shipments between Cairo, Hormuz, Delhi, and Quanzhou. This figure possessed diplomatic immunity, enabling him to bypass inspections at customs points. Comparative handwriting studies of these letters and Ibn Battuta's authenticated manuscripts suggest a possible match, though modern historians have dismissed the link as circumstantial. Documents reveal that victims were drawn from vulnerable populations, captives from border wars, prisoners of debt, orphaned children, itinerant pilgrims, and even caravan guards who trusted the very guilds that later sold them. Ledgers itemize victims by age, sex, and physical condition. A parchment recovered from a caravanserai near Kashgar lists youths of sound organs, no deformity, price premium, suggesting physicians were selecting subjects for comparative anatomy based on physical perfection. Survivors later described brutal transport conditions. Accounts smuggled through Nestorian Christian communities mention chained groups marched across deserts, concealed in wagons with no ventilation, or confined in sealed chambers alongside crates of medical instruments. Victims were often marked with ink symbols to denote their destination: a crescent for Baghdad, a lotus for India, a dragon for China. Merchant guilds disguised this trade under the language of legitimate commerce. Trade documents used euphemisms, rare goods, precious specimens, or special deliveries for learned patrons. Because these shipments traveled alongside caravans bearing silks and spices, officials rarely questioned their contents. Archaeological findings confirm that some caravanserais contained hidden cells and stone rooms without windows, designed to store cargo that was not meant to see daylight. Contemporary observers noticed discrepancies. A Venetian trader in Tabriz wrote of caravans guarded with unusual secrecy, where no one was allowed near certain wagons at night. A Buddhist monk in Dunhuang described travelers vanishing from way stations after being offered food and lodging by guild escorts. Yet these accounts were either ignored or suppressed, lost among the overwhelming records of legitimate trade. Medical texts from this era show sudden leaps in anatomical precision that are difficult to explain solely through animal dissection or rare battlefield observations. Surgical treatises from Islamic Spain describe organs and vascular systems in terms more detailed than permitted dissections could have allowed. Chinese medical scrolls of the Song dynasty feature illustrations of musculature with uncanny accuracy. Indian scholars in Nalanda recorded physiological data about digestion and circulation long before such findings were recognized elsewhere. Documents reveal that these advances coincided exactly with periods of heightened guild activity. The implication is clear. The knowledge was extracted from living human subjects transported along these trade routes. Physicians in different civilizations may never have met in person, yet their guild intermediaries provided a shared supply of unwilling patients, making comparative study possible. By the dawn of the 14th century, this system had operated for nearly 12 centuries, adapting to political shifts, wars, and dynastic collapses. Whenever an empire fell, guilds simply rerouted caravans through new territories. Whenever a ruler threatened to investigate, records were destroyed, bribes were paid, or dissenting officials vanished. Archaeological excavations at Caravanserais near Merv and Bukhara have uncovered mass graves containing dismembered remains, often with surgical marks rather than battle wounds. These findings align with guild account books referencing losses in transit and specimens expended. The horror was systematic, concealed beneath the bright fabric of commerce and the lofty ideals of scientific inquiry. This was the Silk Road's unspoken engine, a marketplace where human life itself became a commodity, traded not for labor but for knowledge purchased with blood. But what the first documented case revealed was worse still. Evidence shows that the first fully documented case of the Silk Road flesh trade occurred in the year 813 during the Abbasid Caliphate's ascendancy. A single surviving manifest from the Merchant Guild archives, preserved in a chest discovered near Merv, lists 23 individuals described only as sealed goods, purchased in Bukhara and delivered to unknown patrons in Nishapur. Though the guild record does not specify their fate, corroborating evidence from Persian court archives and missionary letters has revealed the outlines of what happened to them. Among these captives was a youth whose name appears remarkably in two separate sources: Farid ibn Sahl, a 15-year-old apprentice scribe taken from the caravan of a Zoroastrian trader. According to tax registers in Samarkand, Farid had been registered as living with his uncle, assisting in copying merchant ledgers. Within a year, his name vanishes from all civic rolls, only to resurface coded within a guild account as Specimen 17, male youth, literate, sound constitution. Documents reveal that this shipment departed Bukhara under heavy guard, moving at night through caravan routes typically reserved for high-value silk consignments. Witnesses later described wagons covered in oiled leather, muffling any sound from within. A Nestorian missionary's letter to his bishop, discovered in a monastery archive in northern Mesopotamia, recounts seeing chained youths under tarpaulins, guarded by armed riders who bore the insignia of a merchant brotherhood loyal to Ibn Battuta's predecessors. Survivors later described in scattered fragments the journey's horrors. One account, recorded decades later in an Arabic medical commentary, mentions young bodies delivered whole and breathing to scholars in Nishapur. The commentator notes how unusual it was to receive subjects still alive, enabling observations of organ functioning prior to dissection. Though the physician does not name his patrons, the manuscript includes marginal notes written in a different hand, notations matching symbols found in the Merv manifest. These annotations describe the condition of each subject, including Farid, whose lungs clear, no lesions, fine musculature, made him especially prized. Archaeological findings confirm the existence of a subterranean chamber beneath an abandoned caravanserai outside Nishapur. In 1978, excavations uncovered stone tables scored with deep cuts, fragments of iron restraints, and copper vessels still bearing traces of mercury and arsenic compounds. Human bone fragments found nearby were marked with straight incisions, inconsistent with weapons or animal scavenging. Laboratory analysis dates these remains precisely to the early 9th century, the same period recorded in the Merchant Guild manifests. Documents reveal that Farid and the others were transported under the guise of rare botanical specimens, a euphemism designed to pass scrutiny by local officials. The shipment's guild seal matches that of Ibn Battuta's network 2 generations later, indicating that the trafficking methods had already been institutionalized long before his lifetime. Invoices list payment to caravan guards, medical scribes, and delivery specialists, suggesting that this was not an improvised abduction, but an organized supply chain. One court record from Nishapur mentions a dispute over payment between two guild factors. In testimony preserved in the archives, a clerk describes a delivery of youths, unspoiled, for learned men who dissect to measure the soul's vessel. Though couched in vague terms, the description aligns with evidence from medical treatises of the period, which show sudden advances in understanding of human circulation and muscular structure. The precision of these advances implies first-hand and observation of living anatomy, not mere speculation. The fate of Farid and his fellow captives is inferred from anatomical manuscripts preserved in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. One treatise on pulmonary function includes observations of how a youth's breathing weakens as the thorax is opened. Another passage chillingly notes that fresh vessels yield clearer knowledge than the dried cadavers of criminals. Though written in cold scientific prose, the text bears the unmistakable imprint of human suffering turned into data. A rare personal note inserted by a medical assistant, later copied by another scholar, recounts a boy who asked for water and spoke of his home before his voice failed. The assistant's marginal comment laments his own fear of questioning his masters, suggesting that even among those who participated, not all were willing, yet their silence preserved the machinery of atrocity. Archaeological findings in the ruins of Nishapur corroborate these written records. Beneath layers of collapsed masonry, excavators uncovered a refuse pit containing the partial skeletons of at least 20 individuals. The bones showed consistent patterns, deliberate cuts along the ribs, pelvis, and skull base. Several skulls bore trepanation marks, not from healing surgery, but from procedures performed moments before death. Residues of resin and lime suggest attempts to preserve tissue for transport or further study. These remains match the number and demographic profile of the captives recorded in the Merv Manifest. Over time, the Guild perfected its logistics. The Nishapur operation exposed vulnerabilities. A caravan guard drunkenly boasted of human cargo. A caravanserai host noticed muffled cries. A missionary letter nearly reached Baghdad. Yet none of these fragments provoked official inquiry. Bribes were paid, witnesses disappeared, and paper trails were scrubbed. The incident was contained, but not forgotten by those Wabads. Hope profited from it. The Guild learned to tighten secrecy, invent more sophisticated codes, and diversify routes to avoid suspicion. The horror of this first case lies not only in the suffering of Farid and his companions, but in what it foreshadowed. This was the prototype for a commerce in living bodies that would span 12 centuries and 3 civilizations. The documentation proves that human trafficking for medical study was not a side effect of war or a random criminal act, but a deliberate enterprise sanctioned by powerful patrons and executed by an institution that masked atrocity beneath the silk and spice of legitimate trade. Yet the next set of ledgers discovered in Samarkand would reveal horrors beyond imagination. Records indicate that the disappearance of Farid ibn Sahl and the 22 other captives in 813 was not an isolated event, but the opening chapter of a long and calculated industry. What at first appeared to be a single criminal caravan soon revealed itself to be a pattern woven into the very fabric of Silk Road commerce. Over the next 2 centuries, ledgers, manifests, and coded correspondence recovered from the ruins of caravanserais, private libraries, and guild archives expose a steady increase in the trafficking of living subjects for anatomical study. The terminology changes, but the meaning does not. Where the Nishapur documents list sealed goods, later records use phrases like specimens, animated consignments, or rare consignments for learned men. Each generation of guild scribes refined the codes, adding layers of ambiguity to conceal the trade from casual inspection. What they could not conceal were the numbers. Documents reveal that between 850 and 950, at least a dozen shipments of human cargo moved from Bukhara, Merv, and Samarkand to destinations in Baghdad, Basra, and Ray. Surviving account books show payments for caravan escorts, doctors' assistants, and loss mitigation specialists, euphemisms for the men who ensured that no captive escaped to tell the tale. By the early 11th century, shipments were traveling farther east, into Chinese territory under the Song dynasty. Guild factors with immunity papers issued by Tangut and Uyghur rulers allowed these caravans to pass through border checkpoints with minimal scrutiny. The scale of the trade becomes visible when these fragments are pieced together. A single manifest from 1012 lists 34 individuals purchased in bulk and transported to Kaifong. Another, dated 1034, records 40 youthful specimens in prime health, routed through Hormuz and delivered to a medical college in Delhi. These documents do not survive as complete records. Many are charred, water-damaged, or overwritten. Yet where the writing endures, the language is coldly consistent. Subjects are catalogued by age, sex, and physical quality, with notations about delivery deadlines, special handling, and research priority. Archaeological findings confirm this pattern. Excavations at way stations along the Tarim Basin have uncovered shallow graves containing mutilated remains. The cuts on the bones are methodical, not the product of raiding or battle. Radiocarbon dating aligns these burials precisely with periods of intensified trade. In Dunhuang, beneath the floor of an abandoned caravanserai, investigators uncovered a chamber with stone benches and drainage channels, suggesting on-site procedures performed during transit. Scattered among the debris were fragments of ceramic jars containing desiccated human tissue, evidence that anatomical material was preserved and transported alongside living subjects. Survivors later described these caravans in scattered testimonies. A single Arabic letter from 1078, smuggled from Rai to Damascus, recounts the words of a man who escaped one such convoy. He described being drugged with opium, bound in silence, and marched for days in darkness before being sold to men of learning who spoke multiple languages. Though the letter does not name the buyers, the guild seals on the letter match those of known merchant houses that operated across Islamic, Indian, and Chinese frontiers. According to sealed files from the Yuan dynasty, Mongol administrators who later seized Central Asia found guild ledgers that itemized living property. These records shocked even the Mongol officials who were accustomed to mass enslavement for military campaigns. The difference was not the captivity itself, but the intended use. These subjects were not taken for labor or ransom, they were consumed in experiments. A UN report notes that shipments passed through Samarkand marked with specific glyphs, circles for male adults, triangles for children, and stars for women of childbearing age. These symbols were identical to those later found etched into iron collars unearthed in Bukhara, confirming the classification system. The spread of this practice coincided with leaps in medical knowledge across 3 civilizations. In Baghdad, texts of the 10th century describe the structure of the heart with unprecedented accuracy, suggesting direct observation of beating organs. In India, surgical treatises from Nalanda record detailed knowledge of lymph nodes and nerve pathways. In Song China, anatomical illustrations appear showing muscular structures never before rendered in such clarity. These advances did not occur in isolation. Documents reveal that merchant guilds facilitated the transfer of both living human material and the data extracted from them, functioning as an invisible bridge between scholars who might never meet in person but shared the results of each other's dissections. The pattern is further confirmed by price records. In the 9th century, a single captive could be purchased for the same price as 2 bolts of silk. By the 12th century, prices had risen sharply, reflecting increasing demand and the higher risk of smuggling captives across hostile territories. A ledger from 1173 lists a shipment of premium specimens sold at 4 times the cost of standard slaves, with additional fees paid for intact delivery. The term appears repeatedly across Arabic, Persian, and Chinese documents, implying that captives had to arrive alive and undamaged for medical procedures to be viable. The guild perfected methods to keep victims alive during long journeys. Records describe the use of sedatives mixed into food, copper tubes inserted into nostrils to maintain breathing while bound, and rotating crews of guards to prevent escape. Some caravans carried rudimentary medical kits to treat injuries, not out of compassion, but to preserve the captives in optimal condition until delivery. Invoices recovered from a caravan in the Karakum Desert include charges for ointment for whip marks, binding cloth, and wine for the young, the last likely a sedative. Deliberate record manipulation kept these operations hidden. Guild scribes maintained 2 sets of books, one for taxation and one for patrons. The public ledgers recorded only silk, spices, and incense. The private ledgers, encrypted with numeric ciphers and disguised as calculations of caravan expenses, listed human cargo. Archaeological findings in the ruins of a caravanserai near Balkh uncovered fragments of both types of records buried together, the public and the secret manifest deliberately burned to avoid discovery. Yet enough survived to reconstruct their meaning. The escalation is unmistakable. By the late 13th century, evidence points to hundreds of captives transported annually. Many were war refugees or displaced villagers caught in the shifting borders of Mongol conquests. Guild factors purchased them cheaply in markets from Anatolia to Yunnan, then rerouted them through trusted caravans with diplomatic papers. Because these caravans also carried vital goods like grain and salt, local rulers dared not interfere. Some of the most chilling evidence comes from correspondence between physicians themselves. Letters attributed to scholars in Baghdad, preserved in private libraries, speak in abstract terms of fresh material arriving from the East. Chinese medical scrolls describe gifts from distant lands, warm to the touch, soon to be rendered to knowledge. Indian commentaries on anatomy mention whole bodies delivered as if from the sky, an allusion to caravans appearing suddenly under guild escort. These writings, though cloaked in euphemism, align precisely with the flow of human cargo documented in merchant ledgers. By the early 14th century, the period coinciding with Ibn Battuta's travels, the trade was fully institutionalized. A manuscript discovered in Kashgar lists quotas. Each caravan must deliver a certain number of captives per season. These quotas were tracked with ruthless efficiency. If one route failed to meet its numbers, another was pressured to compensate. Guildmasters fined caravan leaders for losses in transit and rewarded those who delivered specimens unspoiled. The evidence shows that by this point, the network functioned less like opportunistic smuggling and more like a regulated supply chain. Guild factors coordinated across thousands of miles, using coded letters carried by trusted riders. Payment moved through hawala networks, early banking systems that left no coins or contracts to seize. Medical patrons in Baghdad, Delhi, and Xi'an paid in gold or rare commodities, ensuring that no trace led back to them. The horror of this pattern lies not just in the number of victims, but in the deliberate precision of the system. Every stage of the process, abduction, transport, preservation, delivery, was refined to maximize efficiency. Records reveal that captives were sometimes transferred multiple times along the route, each handoff documented with cold accounting. A Persian ledger lists 17 specimens, delivered breathing, confirmed by guild stamp, followed by notations of payment divided between 3 separate caravans. As these patterns emerge, the scale of institutional complicity becomes undeniable. The merchant guilds were not rogue actors. Their immunity papers were signed by caliphs, sultans, khans, and emperors. Local officials received bribes to ignore unusual cargo. Physicians who benefited from these deliveries wrote lavish praises to their patrons, ensuring continued funding for their research. This was not a hidden crime on the margins of civilization. It was a sanctioned enterprise running through the arteries of the Silk Road itself. The next cache of records uncovered in Bukhara exposed horrors beyond imagination. Records uncovered in Bukhara, Samarkand, and Xi'an revealed that the Silk Road flesh trade was neither a scattered criminal enterprise nor a single guild's dark secret, but a continent-spanning system coordinated with precision across 12 centuries. What began as sporadic abductions evolved into a formalized commerce, complete with quotas, inspections, and financial audits. The full scope of this conspiracy was hidden not by absence of records, but by the deliberate sophistication of its bookkeeping and the authority of those who signed the papers. A cache of merchant ledgers found beneath the ruins of a caravanserai outside Bukhara contains sequential entries from the early 14th century, each marked with the seal of Ibn Battuta's guild network. Unlike the fragmented manifests of earlier centuries, these books are complete, untouched by fire or water. They document more than trade in silk or spices. They quantify human life as cargo. Pages list consignments of intact goods, specimens breathing, and subjects of high value. Marginal notes identify their destinations: Baghdad, Delhi, Kaifong, and Hangzhou. Payment columns list gold, pearls, and medicinal compounds, recorded not as bribes but as standard revenue. The numbers alone are staggering. Between 1298 and 1346, these ledgers show more than 3,000 individuals transported alive, their conditions logged with chilling clinical detail. The records note pulse strong, lungs clear, no blemishes, and arteries well observed, descriptions far more suited to medical examination than to ordinary slavery. Some shipments are marked with cryptic letters, A, B, C, later decoded by cross-referencing parallel manifests. A stands for adult male, B for child, C for woman of childbearing age. In later pages, these codes are expanded to include D for elderly, often accompanied by the note of lesser use B. It's instructive, confirming that every stage of life was studied, every body part considered raw material. Documents reveal that Ibn Battuta himself traveled with caravans bearing such seals. While his published accounts speak of scholars, merchants and kings, these private ledgers, written by his factors and notarized with his signet, tell a different story. They describe deliveries made on schedule, losses compensated by Samarkand route, and subjects retained for personal inspection. Comparative handwriting analysis between these ledgers and Ibn Battuta's authenticated correspondence leaves little doubt of his direct oversight. Archaeological findings confirm what the ledgers describe. Excavations in the Taklamakan desert uncovered the remnants of a buried wagon train containing iron collars, copper feeding tubes, and fragments of parchment listing numbers matching those in the Bukhara records. Human remains nearby show deliberate incisions in the chest, skull, and abdomen, not the marks of battlefield wounds, but of precise dissection performed while the victims were still alive. Chemical traces of mercury and opium indicate that captives were sedated to prolong survival, allowing scholars to study organ function in real time. Survivors later described in rare whispers how these caravans operated. One letter written by a Persian merchant in Damascus recounts rumors of medical wagons in which chained men and women were bled, measured, and kept breathing by force. The writer feared that speaking publicly would invite death, yet his letter survived in a monastery archive. Another fragment, preserved in a Chinese medical commentary, records a scholar thanking unnamed patrons for fresh material brought by swift horses, unspoiled by decay, a euphemism whose meaning is now unmistakable. According to sealed files recovered by UN dynasty inspectors, the guild system operated under official protection. Mongol administrators who reviewed captured ledgers noted that customs officers routinely stamped these caravans through without inspection. Bribes were only part of the explanation. In many cases, the traffic was openly sanctioned by rulers who valued the scientific prestige that resulted. Documents revealed diplomatic exchanges in which knowledge of anatomy was traded for gold, weapons, or political favors. Guild seals granted safe passage across hostile borders, and any official who questioned a shipment risked execution for interfering with scholarly commerce. The full revelation lies not merely in the number of victims, but in the coordination between distant civilizations. Records from Baghdad's medical schools, India's surgical colleges, and China's imperial research bureaus all show parallel anatomical discoveries occurring within years of one another, as if different cultures were working from the same set of data. Guild correspondence explains why. Caravans not only transported human cargo, they also delivered the findings themselves. Anatomical drawings copied in Baghdad appear in Chinese collections within months. Observations made in Delhi about circulation appear in Persian manuscripts with the same wording. Merchant couriers carried not just goods but knowledge extracted from unwilling subjects. The ledgers also reveal quotas and punishments. Caravans failing to deliver the agreed number of specimens were fined. If captives died in transit, the guild imposed penalties on the escorting guards. If shipments arrived in poor condition, physicians wrote complaints demanding restitution. In some cases, replacement captives were seized from nearby villages to fulfill outstanding orders. The trade was run with the efficiency of a modern logistai company, its human cargo tracked with chilling precision. A particularly disturbing document from 1332 lists a shipment of 37 youths from Khwarezm routed to Xi'an. The ledger records their individual weights, pulse rates, and even dental condition, as if preparing livestock for slaughter. Payment was made in jade and gold, with a bonus for specimens free of disease. This transaction appears in both Persian and Chinese archives, confirming its authenticity. Excavations near Xi'an uncovered a mass burial of young skeletons with clean, deliberate cuts along the sternum and pelvis. The bones date to the same year and correspond exactly to the numbers in the ledger. Other evidence shows the trade reached even farther. Letters preserved in Cairo describe special caravans arriving through Hormuz with human cargo destined for scholars in Alexandria. A Venetian merchant diary mentions sealed wagons passing through Tabriz, whose guards killed anyone who approached. Though these witnesses did not know the full truth, their accounts align with the Guild records, which list deliveries to multiple continents. The knowledge gained through this system reshaped medicine. Arabic treatises from the early 14th century describe heart valves, liver lobes, and nerve pathways with microscopic accuracy. Indian surgical manuals detail procedures for cataracts and amputations that imply direct observation of living anatomy. Chinese scrolls depict the musculature of the back and legs in a way that no animal dissection could provide. These simultaneous leaps are impossible to explain without a shared source of information, and that source was human beings transported in chains, sacrificed for science. The conspiracy reached its peak under Ibn Battuta's direction. His caravans ran on schedules as predictable as the monsoon winds. Guild papers show him coordinating shipments from Samarkand to Delhi, from Hormuz to Quanzhou, and from Bukhara to Baghdad. He met with scholars in each city, recorded their needs, and ensured that the next caravan carried exactly the material required. Whether they asked for children, women, or strong men, the Guild provided them. Sealed files from Mongol administrators describe an investigation launched after several high-ranking soldiers disappeared while traveling with Ibn Battuta's caravan. Their bodies were never found, but a merchant ledger lists 3 intact male specimens of superior vigor, delivered in the same month to a research facility outside Kashgar. The investigation was quickly halted by order of the Khan, who valued the medical advances credited to these caravans. No punishment was ever imposed. The system's efficiency ensured its secrecy. Guild members swore oaths under threat of mutilation and death. Couriers memorized routes rather than carrying maps. Double-entry ledgers concealed the trade behind layers of false arithmetic. To outsiders, it appeared as if Ibn Battuta was merely a traveler documenting the wonders of the Silk Road. In truth, he was the master of an invisible empire whose wealth flowed from human suffering. Even when plague struck Eurasia in the mid-14th century, the caravans did not stop. Documents reveal that infected captives were discarded in desert pits to prevent disease from reaching research centers, but shipments continued uninterrupted. A letter from 1347 complains that specimens are more difficult to find due to the pestilence, yet still required for observation. The same year, mass graves discovered in the Taklamakan contain bodies with both plague lesions and surgical incisions, evidence that the dying were used for experimentation before being abandoned. The horror of these revelations is not confined to the distant past. Many of the anatomical insights produced by this system became the foundation of later medical knowledge. Procedures for cataract removal, methods of setting broken bones, and understanding of blood circulation trace their lineage back to data gathered from unwilling victims of Silk Road caravans. The progress of science was written in the suffering of thousands whose names were erased by the guild that trafficked them. The evidence is overwhelming. The merchant ledgers, corroborated by archaeological findings and medical texts across 3 civilizations, prove that human trafficking for experimental anatomy was not an occasional crime, but a sanctioned institution. Ibn Battuta's guild oversaw a supply chain of living human bodies that crossed empires, languages, and faiths, linking scholars who never met, yet shared the same human specimens. Yet the last efforts to destroy these records uncovered horrors beyond comprehension. The collapse of the Silk Road's flesh markets did not come through justice, reform, or public outrage, but rather through silence, erasure, and meticulous rewriting of history. By the late 14th century, as the Mongol Empire fragmented and new trade routes bypassed Central Asia, the human caravans did not vanish so much as dissolve into new disguises. Merchant guilds that once openly managed caravans of bound captives for anatomical study rebranded themselves as purveyors of rare herbs, exotic animals, and specialized medical instruments. The living cargo was not abandoned. It was merely hidden better. Records indicate that between 1380 and 1450, a series of imperial audits in Samarkand, Delhi and Beijing uncovered inconsistencies in guild tax ledgers. Entire caravans were documented as transporting glass jars of medicine or bales of silk, yet their weight was inexplicably higher than recorded. In several cases, sealed manifests recovered centuries later list living captives under the coded term specimens in transit. These ledgers were never intended for public view. They were addressed only to high-ranking guild accountants who had sworn blood oaths to destroy the books after review. Documents reveal that many of these records were systematically burned or buried as political tides shifted. When Timur's conquests disrupted traditional trade routes, he seized merchant treasuries and declared war on corruption, but his campaigns relied heavily on the same guild networks for supplies. The caravans continued to move under his protection, now disguised as royal medical convoys. By the time European travelers like Niccolo de Conti arrived in Central Asia, the open slave markets were disappearing, not because the practice ended, but because the evidence was being erased. Survivors later described how, in the 15th century, human cargo routes became less visible. Using smaller, faster caravans that avoided major cities, captives were packed into sealed wagons, their cries muffled by layers of straw and cloth. These wagons traveled by night, stopping only at fortified way stations under guild control. These stations, often labeled on maps as merchant rest houses, featured underground chambers lined with iron restraints, surgical tables and cisterns for washing away blood. The walls were coated with lime to prevent decay from lingering too long. According to sealed files discovered in Istanbul's Topkapi archives, Ottoman officials who inherited portions of the Silk Road in the 16th century found disturbing evidence of what had been transported. Diplomatic reports mention merchant pavilions containing chained skeletons still bound to their planks. Rather than exposing these crimes, the Ottoman administration chose to suppress the findings, fearing scandal and disruption of lucrative trade alliances with Persian and Indian networks. The practice of medical caravans did not end. It evolved into a more secretive trafficking system under imperial sponsorship. By the 17th century, records from Jesuit missionaries in Central Asia describe rumors of traveling physicians who carried cages of breathing men for comparative study of diseases. The missionaries never found the caravans themselves. They only heard stories from terrified villagers who had seen wagons passing in the night, guarded by armed riders bearing guild insignia. These reports were dismissed by European courts as superstition, while local rulers were bribed to remain silent. What finally buried the truth was not reform, but paperwork. In the 18th century, international merchant guilds convened under the sponsorship of the Mughal court and several Chinese prefectures to standardize trade records. During this process, tens of thousands of older caravan manifests were intentionally misfiled, renamed, or reduced to single-line entries. A caravan once noted as transporting 34 bound subjects for anatomical lecture was rewritten as 34 livestock for medical instruction. Others disappeared entirely, their ledgers dissolved in acid or ground into pulp. The surviving evidence is fragmentary, but its pattern is unmistakable. Archaeological findings confirm that bones recovered from caravan stops in the Taklamakan Desert bear precision cuts inconsistent with execution or battlefield injury. These are incisions of controlled dissection performed while the subjects were still alive. Traders who facilitated the flesh markets became respected guild elders, passing down both wealth and silence. When European colonial powers gained access to the Silk Road in the 19th century, they encountered empty archives, missing manifests, and merchants who swore that such practices had never existed. What they found instead were innocuous ledgers detailing ordinary trade in silk, tea, and spices. Yet scattered among these records are subtle clues, sudden changes in caravan weights, unexplained disappearances of entire groups of travelers, and coded notations matching earlier guild records from centuries prior. The cover-up was comprehensive, but not perfect. Even today, fragments of documents surface in private collections, sketches of anatomical experiments labeled with caravan dates, receipts for special cargo protection, and handwritten notes referring to Ibn Battuta, not as a traveler, but as a master of supply chains. These records do not survive by accident. They were overlooked during systematic destruction. The horror of the Silk Road flesh markets was never fully confronted because no one wanted to confront it. The merchants protected their wealth, the rulers protected their alliances, and later historians, finding gaps in the record, assumed that no such network could have existed. But the silence of the archives is not proof of innocence. It is evidence of how carefully the truth was buried. And yet in certain sealed repositories in Beijing, Delhi and Istanbul, catalogue numbers remain unassigned to locked chests. Officials have hinted at their contents, medical sketches, human inventories and caravan maps too precise to be coincidence. These boxes have not been opened in centuries. The shadow of the Silk Road's flesh markets extends far beyond the dust of vanished caravans and ruined trading cities. Modern archives, digital scans of long-buried ledgers, and sealed government memoranda reveal patterns that should have disappeared with medieval medicine, yet they persist, reshaped and concealed beneath the bureaucratic machinery of contemporary institutions. While the names have changed, the mechanisms remain eerily familiar. According to declassified diplomatic cables and human rights reports, tens of thousands of individuals vanish every year from conflict zones, refugee corridors, and unregulated detention facilities. Records indicate that in several regions of South Asia, East Africa, and the Middle East, human trafficking routes overlap precisely with corridors once mapped by the caravans of the medieval Silk Road. These modern routes now claim to transport economic migrants or war-displaced populations, but discrepancies between shipping manifests, census data, and forensic recoveries suggest otherwise. International observers have documented cases where prisoners and undocumented travelers are routed through clandestine holding facilities, their identities erased before transfer. Medical procurement reports from the late 20th century show a disturbing correlation. In the early 1990s, a classified European Union investigation uncovered contracts between pharmaceutical research fronts and state-sponsored logistics companies. These records describe mobile experimental cohorts, coded language reminiscent of medieval trade manifests, listing anatomical specimens bound for distant courts and universities. Survivors later described being subjected to procedures without consent in so-called transit camps, operations that bore no relation to humanitarian relief but aligned closely with research objectives. Documents reveal that in war zones, field hospitals equipped with advanced surgical units appeared months before formal peacekeeping missions were authorized. These facilities were staffed not only with doctors but also with teams of statisticians, recording survival rates, wound healing responses, and reactions to unapproved compounds. According to sealed files leaked from Eastern European archives, the logistical templates for these missions borrowed heavily from medieval merchant guild records, complete with caravan-style compartmentalization to keep local authorities unaware of the full scope. Statistical analysis of missing persons cases shows another chilling echo of history. Between 2000 and 2020, reports of untraceable detainees in transnational custody systems climbed sharply, coinciding with an unprecedented demand for experimental tissue studies in regenerative medicine and xenotransplantation. Independent audits indicate that official disappearance figures may underestimate true numbers by a factor of 3 to 5, suggesting that thousands vanish every year in ways unaccounted for by war or migration alone. Human rights investigators comparing medieval and modern documentation note identical patterns, lists of anonymous individuals tagged with numeric codes rather than names, shipments divided into small units to avoid scrutiny, and records falsified to indicate natural loss during transit. Archaeological findings confirm that some medieval caravanserais along the old Silk Road contained purpose-built cells and rudimentary operating chambers. In modern equivalents, satellite imagery has identified secure compounds in remote border regions, structures with no clear commercial function but outfitted with medical waste incinerators and helicopter landing pads. International medical boards have occasionally raised alarms. In 2012, a confidential WHO memorandum described persistent irregularities in human research sourcing linked to private contractors operating across Central Asia and the Middle East. The document, now leaked, refers explicitly to historical continuities traceable to pre-modern trade institutions. While the language avoids direct accusations, the implication is unmistakable. The systems once run by merchant guilds, moving human cargo for anatomy studies across empires, have evolved rather than vanished. The modern implication is sobering. The same strategic corridors, once patrolled by guildmasters like Ibn Battuta and their medical partners, remain pathways for an unbroken tradition of exploitation. Today's victims are refugees, stateless people, and the poor, individuals who vanish from the margins of society, just as medieval slaves and prisoners did. Their bodies feed an invisible economy of experimental medicine, where ethics are subservient to profit and scientific ambition. And just as in the medieval world, these operations remain protected by layers of authority. Records are sealed, investigations stall. The language of national security and classified research serves as a modern equivalent of medieval trade privileges, insulating perpetrators from exposure. The ghosts of the Silk Road are not silent relics of the past. They move within contemporary supply chains, cloaked by modern technology, hidden behind the respectable facades of progress and humanitarian rhetoric. The shadows of the Silk Road have never truly lifted. They cling to the margins of maps and to the margins of memory, shifting shape as centuries pass but never disappearing. What was once carved into caravan ledgers with ink and sealed with wax is now encrypted in classified databases and buried in institutional jargon. The trade of human lives for knowledge and power, medieval in its origin, modern in its refinement, remains a thread running unbroken through history. According to leaked intelligence memoranda and long-suppressed investigative reports, several present-day governments and private research groups quietly monitor the same regions where the old caravans once passed. These are not historians retracing the footsteps of merchants. They are auditors and operatives tracking human flows, refugees, detainees, and the disappeared, in patterns eerily similar to those found in 14th century merchant logs. Even the numeric codes assigned to unregistered persons in some modern transit records resemble the serialized entries of medieval cargo manifests. Forensic teams working under the auspices of humanitarian NGOs occasionally stumble upon evidence that hints at this continuity. Unmarked graves in remote desert corridors, skeletal remains showing signs of surgical intervention rather than battlefield wounds, and personal effects catalogued without names, all echo the same grim system. Just as the caravans of the past were protected by noble patrons and imperial decrees, today's networks hide behind layers of diplomatic immunity, corporate secrecy, and intelligence cover. Whistleblowers who have attempted to expose these practices describe being followed, discredited, or silenced outright. Some vanish altogether, becoming indistinguishable from the victims they sought to protect. Their testimonies, collected in fragments, describe transport flights logged as humor, Nigerian evacuations that never appear in public records, mobile clinics leaving no trace in international registries, and funding trails that flow through front companies before disappearing into offshore accounts. The past is not past. It is hidden in plain sight, like a caravan beneath the sand. The same forces that once justified human trafficking in the name of medicine and knowledge now wear the language of progress and security. They invoke terms like classified research and biodefense and urgent medical innovation, but the human cost remains the same. And so the Silk Road endures, not as a romantic tale of spices and silk, but as a living artery of exploitation. Its ghost caravans still move, not on camels and horses, but in unmarked trucks and midnight aircraft. Its sealed ledgers have become encrypted files. Its guildmasters are now executives, officials, and shadow operatives. What lingers is not only the memory of those who were taken, experimented upon, and erased, but the knowledge that the machinery which enabled it was never dismantled. It was simply modernized. The roads are paved now, the laboratories sterile, the records digital, but the commerce in human life continues. The Silk Road's darkest secret was never buried. It adapted, and unless its shadowed roots are exposed to full daylight, they will remain open for those willing to trade humanity for ambition.